when another wrestler decides he's going to decide who wins is bullshit.
Why do you think he did that?
He's a motherfucker. There's no other way he can say it. He's a piece of shit.
He scared the shit out of me. That quote did not come from one WWE legend. It came from several Hall of Famers, men who had spent decades in some of the toughest locker rooms in professional wrestling history. They all said it, and most of them went one step further. They admitted Scott Steiner was better than everybody. That claim has power. Steiner walked into this business with something most performers could only fake: real toughness. A legitimate amateur base that commanded instant respect from every veteran in every building he worked in. His presence was different from anything. Before we go further, hit the hype feature below and give hype to this video right now. It only takes a second, because being terrifying does not automatically make someone the best. The proof is right here in this story. To understand why so many veterans feared Scott Steiner, you have to go back before the wrestling. You have to go back to the University of Michigan. Scott Steiner was a competitive collegiate wrestler in the Big Ten Conference throughout the 1980s. That conference was one of the most competitive wrestling environments in the country, and Steiner competed there for 4 full years. His career record at Michigan was 125 wins, 51 losses, and 2 draws. In his senior year, he wrestled in the 190-pound weight class and earned All-American status, finishing 6th at the NCAA Division I National Championships. He earned letter winner designations 4 separate times across his college career. Those numbers might look like standard athletics on paper. Inside a professional wrestling locker room in the 1980s, they meant something completely different. At that time, the most important distinction in the wrestling business was the difference between a worker and a shooter. A worker performed the choreography. A shooter could make it real if the situation demanded it. Scott Steiner walked into professional wrestling as both. Every veteran in every building understood that within minutes of being near him. His brother Rick carried the same credentials. Rick held a program record for the fastest pin time at 15 seconds. Together, the Steiner brothers represented something genuinely rare, a tag team that every single locker room respected, not because of what they could do on television, but because of what they could do for real. Old school promoters valued this enormously. They believed legitimate toughness gave the entire product credibility. By that measure, Steiner should have been exactly what those promoters prized above everything else. And in many ways, early on, he was precisely that. The peers said as much. Booker T, a man who competed at the top level for nearly 2 decades, put it plainly. He said Rick Steiner and Scott Steiner were 2 of the best as far as tag team wrestling goes. Booker T knew that division from the inside. Those words came from someone who had no reason to overstate the case. Bret Hart is one of the most critical evaluators of in-ring work in the history of professional wrestling. He developed a rating system based on look, promo ability, and in-ring skill. When that system was applied to prime Scott Steiner, he scored a perfect 10 in both look and in-ring ability. That is a score Bret Hart almost never gave to anyone. Hart also cited a 1994 tag match between the Steiner brothers and the Hart brothers as one of the finest exhibitions of technical wrestling in his entire career. Eric Bischoff was similarly direct. He said he liked the Steiners from the very beginning, and that Scott's in-ring abilities were nothing short of amazing. Coming from a man not known for generous praise, those words carry real weight. But the legitimacy that earned all that respect also created a version of Steiner that was nearly impossible to manage. The authenticity was not just in the wrestling, it was in the temperament, the hair-trigger reactions, the refusal to back down from anyone, including the people cutting his checks. And that combination had real consequences. Jim Ross confirmed the most telling story from this era. Bill Watts began carrying a loaded firearm to his office specifically because of Scott Steiner. Not as a general security precaution, because of the individual threat Steiner personally represented. One man, one situation. A promoter who had spent his entire adult life around legitimately dangerous people felt the need to arm himself because of a single talent on his own roster. That is not a badge of honor. That is a warning sign dressed up as a legend. Maven told a different story, but illustrated the same truth. He described the experience of being booked to beat Steiner on television, seeing that massive silhouette approaching him, knowing he had to stand in front of a future Hall of Famer and deliver news that man would not want to hear. The fear was not about physical harm in that specific moment. It was about genuine uncertainty, about not knowing how Steiner would respond to information he did not want to receive. Steiner had real tools. His base was completely genuine. His collegiate foundation was not decoration. It was the bedrock that that every other part of his career was built upon. But the real tools and the volatile personality came as a single package, and that package would define every chapter of his career from this point forward. Before dismissing the legend entirely, you have to look honestly at what Steiner produced inside that ring during his peak years. From 1989 to roughly 1994, he was doing things that had no business coming from someone his size. Steiner competed at around 240 pounds. That is a full heavyweight, but he was performing moves typically reserved for junior heavyweights and luchadors, men 100 pounds lighter than him. He moved with their speed and their precision, and then applied his own mass and force to the execution. The combination was unlike anything the American wrestling scene had produced before. It was genuinely ahead of its time. His most famous innovation was the Frankensteiner. The name sounds comedic. The move was anything but. It is often compared to a standard Hurricane Rana, but Steiner and multiple analysts made the mechanical distinction clear. A standard Hurricane Rana rolls through to a pin. The Frankensteiner was designed as a spike. Steiner would leap before his opponent hit the ropes, meet them in midair on the rebound, and use his leg strength to drive their head directly into the mat. The Wrestling Observer newsletter awarded it Best Wrestling Maneuver in both 1989 and 1990. Back-to-back years. That is not a novelty act receiving awards. That is a genuine technical innovation being recognized by the most serious evaluators in the industry at the time. Then there was the Steiner screwdriver, a move described as a unicorn in professional wrestling history. The screwdriver combined a vertical suplex lift with a sit-out tombstone piledriver. Steiner would hoist the opponent straight into the air in suplex position, rotate their body so their abdomen faced him, then drop into a seated position with their head between his thighs and spike directly into the mat. The recipient had almost no ability to protect their own neck during the sequence. The move was so feared that it was almost never kicked out of. When the Steiner brothers arrived in the WWF in 1993, Vince McMahon allowed it briefly before recognizing the liability it represented. Peers compared it to the move Owen Hart later used to break Steve Austin's neck, though reports noted that Steiner angled his hips carefully to create clearance. Visual brutality, real precision underneath. Then Japan, because what happened in Japan placed the Steiner brothers among the greatest tag teams in the world at any point in wrestling history. The Japanese wrestling culture of the early 1990s valued shooter credentials and strong style above almost everything else. It was the most demanding environment in the sport. The Steiner brothers were a perfect fit for it. They competed against legends including Hiroshi Hase and Kensuke Sasaki. Hase was a former Olympian. The bar was as high as professional wrestling got. On March 21st, 1991, in front of 64,000 fans at the Tokyo Dome, the Steiner brothers defeated Hase and Sasaki to capture the IWGP Tag Team Championship. That match received the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Match of the Year award. The award covered the entire global industry, 64,000 people in attendance. The most prestigious match award in professional wrestling. In the most demanding market in the world, confirmation at the absolute highest level available. Scott spent much of that match dismantling Hayes with standing cloverleafs and massive overhead belly-to-belly suplexes. He looked unimpressed by the competition. That was deliberate. Against a former Olympian, in front of the most critical audience in the world, Steiner projected complete dominance. The Steiner brothers also built a tag team blueprint that modern wrestling still draws from directly. Their double-team innovations were ahead of their era by years. The Steinerizer was a top-rope bulldog while the opponent sat on the partner's shoulders. The Steiner device was a clothesline from the top rope with the opponent in an electric chair position. The Doomsday DDT was their version of a classic, showcasing Steiner's ability to blend technical precision with serious impact. Peers like Sting and Lex Luger described working with the Steiners as stiff and terrifying. In that era, from those men, that was a compliment. It meant the Steiners raised the standard for every opponent they faced. None of this is exaggerated. The Tokyo Dome match was elite work by any measurement. The innovations were real and documented. The peer respect was earned through performance, not reputation. But here is where the framing matters. The stiffness and fear that came alongside that quality were not just natural consequences of competing at a high level. They were a preview of everything that would complicate Steiner's career going forward. Pain was part of the package whenever he was involved. Uncertainty was built into every situation, and the same intensity that elevated his matches also made him a genuine problem in every building he worked in. The argument that Steiner was better than everybody rests most heavily on this window between 1989 and 1994. The combination of size, speed, genuine toughness, and technical innovation was unmatched in that era. His peers do not dispute it. They admit it clearly. But peak windows close. And what happens when the peak closes is where a career's real character gets revealed. The year 1993 was the most significant fork in the road of Scott Steiner's entire career. What happened at that fork tells you something important that goes well beyond raw talent. Bruce Pritchard and Pat Patterson were two of the most influential men inside the WWF at that time. Pritchard was a key creative figure who had the ear of Vince McMahon on almost every important decision. Patterson was a trusted advisor with enormous sway over talent positioning and how the company developed its biggest stars. Both of them were so impressed with Scott Steiner that they brought a bold proposal directly to Vince. They wanted Steiner to enter the 1993 Royal Rumble as a surprise entrant, win the match, and then defeat Bret Hart for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania 9. This was not a featured mid-card slot. This was not a strong tag team run to keep him visible. This was the Royal Rumble victory and the WrestleMania main event, the two highest positions in the entire industry. If it had happened, Steiner would have become the face of the WWF nearly a full decade before he reached any version of top-tier singles status. Instead of the forgettable Hogan versus Yokozuna finish that WrestleMania 9 actually produced, the show could have launched a completely new era built around Steiner. Pritchard viewed Steiner as a generational athlete, someone who came along once in a very long time. Patterson recognized what he described as the it factor, that intangible quality separating genuine stars from merely talented performers. These were experienced men who had evaluated hundreds of wrestlers over many years in the business. When both of them agreed that strongly on one individual, that was a meaningful signal about what they believed the business was looking at. Vince hesitated. His concern was Steiner's height. At 6 feet 1 inch, Steiner did not project the Hogan-like stature Vince associated with a world champion at that time. He wanted someone who read as physically larger than life from the back row of a 20,000-seat arena. Steiner was physically imposing in every real sense, but he was not conventionally tall. That concern was enough to stall the entire plan before it could move forward. Then there was Steiner himself. He did not fully understand what was being offered to him. He was told about a possible Royal Rumble interaction involving his brother, but the full picture was never clearly explained. Nobody told him directly that the plan was to make him WWF World Champion. Without that information, his loyalty to Rick took over completely. He did not want to split the team. He did not want Rick's sideline while Scott chased a singles career. So the opportunity passed without converting into anything. The Steiner brothers left the WWF in 1994, frustrated with the creative direction and the handling of the tag division. You can frame that sympathetically. Loyalty to family is genuinely admirable, but loyalty alone does not fully explain the outcome. One of the largest opportunities in the history of professional wrestling appeared directly in front of Scott Steiner. The most influential people in the biggest company in the world were vouching for him at the highest possible level, and it did not convert. Whether that came from incomplete information, genuine loyalty to Rick, or not being fully prepared for that level of spotlight, the result was identical. The moment passed and never came back in that form. This is the first clear signal in Steiner's story that his career was not purely about talent. Talent opens doors. What you choose to do when those doors open determines everything else. That same question would appear again and again. Before that WWF opportunity arrived, Steiner had already been building a reputation inside WCW that made him extremely difficult to manage. The most revealing story from that period is also one of the most remarkable things on record from that era. In 1992, Bill Watts took over WCW as the head booker. Watts was old school in every sense. He valued legitimacy above almost everything else. He wanted men with genuine athletic backgrounds in prominent positions because he believed it added real credibility to the presentation. He wanted the product to feel physically honest. By every measure, Steiner should have thrived under Watts. He had exactly what Watts claimed to value most in a talent. It did not work out that way. Watts redirected his booking focus toward the Miracle Violence connection. The team of Terry Gordy and Steve Williams and the Steiner brothers found themselves pushed down the tag team division they had helped build and define. Steiner was not built to accept that quietly. He never had been. His specific frustration centered on the push given to Eric Watts, Bill's own son. Steiner viewed Eric as someone who who had not earned the position he was being handed because of his last name and his connection to the man running the company. Steiner said exactly that, out loud, to anyone willing to listen and to several people who were not. In a business where accepting frustrations quietly was the expected behavior, Steiner chose directness over personal survival every single time. The tension escalated beyond professional disagreement into something considerably more serious. Jim Ross confirmed the story that has followed this era ever since. Watts began carrying a loaded firearm specifically to his office because of Scott Steiner, not as a general precaution, because of the individual and specific threat that Steiner personally represented. A promoter who had spent his entire career surrounded by legitimately dangerous men felt the need to arm himself because of one talent on his own payroll. The Steiners left WCW in November 1992. They walked away from a guaranteed contract rather than continue in an environment that disrespected them and elevated people they had no respect for. Steiner sacrificed real money to maintain what he believed was right. Within the logic of who he was, that action was completely consistent with his entire history. From one angle that reads as a form of integrity, Steiner refused to be devalued. He placed his own standards above financial comfort and job security. By the late 1990s, the toll of everything Steiner had demanded from his body was becoming impossible to conceal. Years of performing the Frankensteiner and the Steiner screwdriver had done serious damage. His back had been compromised through surgery. His biceps had been torn. The accumulation of high-impact matches and aggressive landings over a decade had taken a catastrophic physical toll. The body that had performed at the Tokyo Dome was breaking down from the inside. Most wrestlers fade when that happens. They slow down gradually, try to hide the decline behind experience and positioning, and eventually become a lesser version of what they once were. Steiner chose a completely different path. He reinvented himself from the foundation up, and for a period of time, the reinvention genuinely worked in ways that few career transformations in wrestling history have matched. At Super Brawl 8 in February 1998, Steiner turned on his brother Rick during a match against Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, the Outsiders, and joined the New World Order. This was more than a storyline change. It was a total transformation in every visible way. He cut the mullet. He bleached his hair and beard blonde. He began wearing chainmail and sunglasses to the ring. He became Big Papa Pump, the genetic freak, a character so loaded with genuine menace and absurdity simultaneously that audiences did not quite know whether to be entertained or frightened. Most chose both at the same time, which is exactly where the most compelling characters in wrestling history have always lived. The physical shift matched the character shift entirely. Steiner added an enormous amount of muscle mass to support the new presentation. Analysts described the result as looking like two road warriors compressed into a single body, an image that was simply impossible to ignore from any seat in any arena. That new physique masked the structural damage underneath by creating a completely different kind of physical presence. He could no longer perform the athletic sequences of his early career, so he stopped trying to. He leaned into brawling. He leaned into physical intimidation. He leaned into the microphone in ways he had never explored before, and discovered that this new version of him connected with audiences in ways the technical showcase never quite had. The clearest way to understand the two versions is this. In his early career, Steiner was a better worker. His in-ring technical ability was elite and documented across multiple markets. He was performing moves that would not become standard for another decade. But as Big Papa Pump, he became a better superstar. The character landed with mainstream audiences more broadly and more consistently. The catchphrases cut through. The promos were unpredictable. The physical presentation was impossible to look away from. Eric Bischoff spoke to this directly. He said he liked the Steiners from the very beginning and that Scott's in-ring abilities were nothing short of amazing. But Bischoff also acknowledged the volatility that was permanently attached to the package throughout this reinvention period. The victory over Goldberg at Fall Brawl 2000 showed how high the new version of Steiner could perform. In a no disqualification environment, Steiner used a lead pipe and the Steiner recliner to render Goldberg completely unconscious. That was one of the most decisive losses in Goldberg's career to that point. No one else in WCW had achieved that level of dominance over Goldberg on a major show. The match positioned Steiner as a genuine top-of-card force in the final chapter of the promotion. He won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship from Booker T in late 2000 and led the Magnificent Seven faction as the primary villain during the promotion's final months. For a specific and real window of time, the reinvented version of Scott Steiner operated at the very top level of the business. But the honest framing has to stay in place. The reinvention was necessary because the original version was no longer physically possible. Every perfectly landed promo was also a reminder that the ring work could no longer carry the same weight it once had. The character covered the physical limitation brilliantly. It did not remove it. Being a great superstar is a real skill. But it is a different skill from the one Steiner demonstrated in his technical prime. The reinvention was brilliant as a survival mechanism. As proof that he was better than everybody, it was something considerably less than that. Now we reach the stories most people remember when they think about Scott Steiner away from cameras and storylines. The fear was not just about his wrestling credentials. It was deeply personal. It was immediate. And on at least one occasion, it was dangerously physical. Many people treat these incidents as entertaining legend. What they actually reveal is some of the most important evidence against the better-than-everybody claim. Diamond Dallas Page was one of the most genuinely popular performers in WCW during its peak years. He connected with audiences in a way that felt completely earned. He worked hard. He improved consistently. He was well-liked by nearly everyone in that locker room. He was also, on one specific night, on the receiving end of one of the most alarming backstage confrontations in WCW history. In 2000, a real physical fight broke out between Steiner and DDP backstage. The confrontation reportedly started because of remarks Steiner had made about DDP's wife, Kimberly Page. What followed was not a heated argument. It was not a disagreement settled with raised voices. According to witnesses, Steiner lowered his head and drove DDP approximately 20 feet across the room before they landed. DDP described the moment himself. He said Steiner put his head down and drove him. He said it had to be 20 feet before they landed. He said it was scary, that the moment felt completely surreal. Several people present had to physically intervene. The phrase used by those witnesses was that they had to save Page's life. DDP is not a small man. He is not someone who avoided confrontation in that locker room. The fact that Steiner left that kind of impression on a peer of that caliber tells you something genuine about the level of force involved. This was not a controlled professional dispute. This was uncontrolled aggression directed at a colleague in a workplace setting, carried past any point of professional reasonableness. Think about what an incident like that creates inside a locker room over the days that follow. Producers learned this the hard way over extended time. When Steiner was WCW champion, producers were genuinely afraid to cut his microphone or attempt to script his segments. He had been granted unprecedented live television freedom, largely because the people responsible for the product feared what would happen if they tried to manage him properly. That freedom produced some of Steiner's most memorable on-air moments in professional wrestling. It also created genuine chaos that management had no clean way to resolve or contain going forward. He took unscripted shots at Ric Flair on live broadcasts. He said things about WCW leadership that had not been approved and could not be taken back. Sometimes those moments felt like the most authentic thing on television that night. Sometimes they created situations that management could neither contain nor address cleanly. Vince Russo expressed genuine admiration for what Steiner could have been. He said that maybe if Steiner had been in WWE, he would have been one of the biggest stars ever, that he could have feuded with Steve Austin at a level that might have redefined that era. That is a compelling idea, but it is a hypothetical built around a version of Steiner that never fully existed in any single promotion for a sustained period of time. Here's the direct argument. Fear builds myths, and the myth of Scott Steiner is powerful and genuinely real. DDP really was driven across a room by one man. Producers really were afraid to cut his microphone. A promoter really kept a firearm at work specifically because of him. Those are documented facts. But a myth built primarily on fear is a fragile foundation. Fear does not produce great matches on its own. Fear does not steer a career toward the ceiling that talent should allow. A locker room being afraid of you is not the same as being the best performer in that locker room. At some point, the story must be carried by consistent results. And consistent results across the full arc never quite reached what the fear suggested they should. When Steiner became WCW World Champion in late 2000, something specific and real happened. For a brief window, the myth and the actual results pointed in the same direction at the same time. He was WCW Champion and carried himself as if every argument had already been settled before the bell rang. WCW in 2000 was a company in serious trouble. The political situation inside had spiraled out of control. Ratings were falling consistently with no sign of recovery. Multiple factions of talent competed for creative control in ways that damaged the product every single week. The locker room was fractured in multiple directions simultaneously. Into that collapsing environment, Steiner arrived with a championship and a complete refusal to pretend that anything was functioning properly. He said what he actually believed about Ric Flair, about the people running the company, about the state of the product itself, and what was fundamentally wrong with it. And in a roster full of carefully managed performances and politically calculated promos, those unscripted moments felt like the only genuinely real thing on WCW television during that period. Industry analysis frames this period consistently. Steiner was viewed as WCW's final success story, a homegrown talent who had survived years of political chaos and arrived at the the top on his own terms without owing favors to the people who typically controlled who rose. Flair had acknowledged earlier in their history that he was prepared to drop the NWA title to Steiner, recognizing him as a future of the industry at that time. The complicated dynamic between them ran deep through both careers. But context matters when evaluating the championship run, honestly. The company was in its final months. The prestige of the WCW title in 2001 was not what it had been in 1991. Holding a championship on a sinking ship is an achievement. It is not the same as holding that championship when the ship runs at full capacity. The value of the belt reflected the health of the organization carrying it, and that organization was dying. When WWE purchased WCW in 2001, Steiner chose to sit out his remaining high-paying AOL Time Warner contract rather than sign with WWE immediately. He was owed money from the deal. He was not going to walk into a new organization without that being fully addressed. Some people called that arrogance. Others said it was a man who understood his own value and acted on that understanding accordingly. Both readings carry partial truth. The confidence was real and the stance was defensible, but so was the cost. While the contract played out, the industry moved on. Stars were being made and positioned. Feuds were being built. And when Steiner finally arrived in WWE in late 2002, he was walking into the most professionally damaging chapter of his career. He made his WCW run feel real by being reckless. That approach worked in the short term, but short terms always end. What follows reveals whether anything lasting was built underneath. The WWE chapter is the strongest argument against the claim that Scott Steiner was better than everybody. It is where the myth encountered the physical reality of what his body had actually become by that point, and the result was painful to witness even for people who believed completely in what he had once been. In November 2002, Steiner debuted at Survivor Series at Madison Square Garden. The crowd reaction was described as thunderous. Madison Square Garden is one of the most demanding venues in professional wrestling. The audience there knows the history of the business with a depth that few other audiences anywhere can match. And they gave Steiner a reception that revealed exactly how much credit he had built across his career. They had not forgotten what he was. They were ready for him. What followed across the next 18 months has been described as one of the biggest missed opportunities in WWE history. The complete picture is more complicated than simply saying Steiner underperformed. The first mistake was the booking itself. WWE cast Steiner as a babyface hero to build a program against Triple H. The fundamental problem was that every element of the Big Papa Pump character was constructed around being a villain. The narcissism, the aggression, the unscripted hostility directed at everyone around him. None of those qualities convert naturally into crowd sympathy. You cannot ask audiences to root for a character whose entire appeal is built on being a genuine threat to everybody nearby. The character was not built for heroic positioning. Asking it to function that way was a fundamental mismatch from the very first day of the program. The second issue was the medical reality. WWE staff were reportedly aware of Steiner's condition 6 months before he signed his contract. During his entire main event feud with Triple H, including their headline match at the Royal Rumble in January 2003, Steiner's foot was by his own description totally dead. To walk to the ring, he wore a heavy medical brace and taped his foot into a rigid position. He was competing in what amounted to a full cast strapped to his leg. He could not run normally. He could not perform the overhead suplexes that had defined his identity as a performer for an entire decade. He could not pivot for lateral movement. The explosive physical quality that had made him unlike anyone else on any roster was simply gone from his toolkit entirely. After his WWE release, Steiner underwent surgery in which doctors broke his foot completely, performed a tendon transfer, and inserted 9 screws and a metal plate to restore whatever function was possible. 9 screws and a plate. This was the reconstruction of a foot that had entirely stopped functioning. Not a minor repair, not a standard procedure. A complete rebuild of the most fundamental tool in his physical arsenal. The third factor was Triple H himself. Triple H was managing a partially torn quadriceps during the same period. The two main performers in the highest profile program on Raw were both working through serious physical limitations simultaneously. Under those conditions, the matches they produced were never going to reflect what either man was capable of when healthy and unrestricted. Steiner has said he can barely watch his WWE work from that period, that the paralyzed foot took away the explosive quality that made his wrestling worth watching, that the gap between what was appearing on screen and what he knew he was capable of is so obvious to him that revisiting those matches is genuinely difficult. That tells you something important. This was not a performer who stopped caring about quality. This was someone fighting to compete on the biggest stage in professional wrestling while one of his feet had functionally ceased to work. That context deserves honest acknowledgement, but circumstances do not change what was recorded. The matches still looked looked exactly the way they looked. For fans who encountered Steiner for the first time through this 2002 to 2004 window, reconciling those performances with the legend they had heard about was nearly impossible. After the Triple H program ended without resolution, WWE placed Steiner in a mid-card tag team with Andrew Martin. He was released in 2004. A thunderous Madison Square Garden reception converted into a mid-card release inside 18 months. The gap between the reception and the release is stark. An arena ready to receive him as a genuine top-level star. A booking structure that could not convert that energy into something sustainable. A body working against everything the booking required. The WWE chapter matters specifically because this was where the claim was supposed to be confirmed on the largest stage possible. Instead of confirmation, the run became the primary argument critics used every time someone tried to make the case for Steiner's greatness. Some of that criticism is demonstrably unfair given the documented medical reality, but even accounting for everything, the record is the record. After WWE, Steiner moved to TNA, and the different environment made a genuine difference. TNA was a smaller stage with less pressure in every direction. The schedule was less demanding. The expectations were calibrated differently. For a body that had been through what Steiner's had endured by that point, a lower intensity environment allowed him to work at a pace that suited what he still had, rather than constantly exposing everything he had lost. He joined TNA in 2006 and found a lane that genuinely fit where he was in his career. He was not expected to carry a full-time main event schedule on a surgically reconstructed body. He was expected to be Scott Steiner, the presence, the character, the legitimacy that time and injury had not managed to remove, that he could still deliver completely. In 2008, Steiner joined the Main Event Mafia alongside Kurt Angle, Sting, Kevin Nash, and Booker T. The faction was built around the premise that the industry's veterans were being disrespected by the younger generation. As the group's enforcer, Steiner handled the intimidation work. He was the most unpredictable element in the group, the factor that gave the Mafia genuine menace beyond accumulated seniority. During this TNA period, Steiner produced what has become perhaps the most widely seen moment of his entire career. In 2008, building toward a triple threat match at Sacrifice against Samoa Joe and Kurt Angle, Steiner delivered a promo that became known permanently as Steiner Math. He stood in that ring and calculated his winning probability based on his status as a genetic freak. He removed Kurt Angle from the equation entirely on the grounds that Angle had no realistic winning chance. He redistributed those odds in his own favor. He added them to his base genetic freak advantage and arrived at a combined winning probability for himself that exceeded 141%. Here is the detail that elevated that promo beyond simple comedy. The actual arithmetic was correct. The additions Steiner performed genuinely reached the figures he quoted. The underlying logic about how probability works in wrestling matches was completely without foundation, but if you followed the mathematical steps he laid out, the numbers added up exactly as he claimed. Samoa Joe later revealed that producers needed a second take because Petey Williams was laughing too hard during the first recording, but the first take was used anyway. The genuine conviction and frustration in Steiner's delivery made the promo more compelling than any polished version could have been. That promo escaped the wrestling audience entirely and reached people who had never watched a complete match. It circulated for years and then over a decade. It became a cultural reference point well outside professional wrestling. Steiner became unforgettable through this era, but the honest framing stays in place. Much of what made him unforgettable in this period came from chaos and extremes rather than clean, sustained greatness. The trachea injury in Puerto Rico in 2007 illustrated this directly. A kick to the throat from Apollo tore his trachea. He was given only hours to live as his lungs filled with blood. Doctors placed him into a medically induced coma and cut through his pectoral muscles and ribs to repair the damage. The surgery left a permanent, visible indentation in his chest cavity that became simply part of his appearance from that point on. He returned to the ring 1 month after this near-fatal procedure. The 1-month return is almost impossible to process. Unforgettable, but unforgettable and better than everybody are not the same claim. So where does all of this leave us? Scott Steiner was not better than everybody. That claim does not survive the full record. His peak window was extraordinary. The Tokyo Dome match. The innovations that changed what a heavyweight could do inside a ring. The toughness that made veterans recalibrate just by being in the same building. The big Papa Pump reinvention that kept him relevant a decade past his physical prime. All of it is real, all documented, all freely admitted by peers who had every reason to be honest. But his career was also shaped by choices that limited everything around him, by volatility that made every environment harder to sustain, by a body that paid an extreme price, by moments that should have become championships and did not. Here is the honest conclusion. Steiner had genuine toughness, technical innovation, and a character that could not be manufactured from nothing. Even his failures make sense when you understand the context. context. The drop foot was real. The chaos came from a man who refused to perform fakeness inside a business built entirely around it. That refusal is also what made him rare. His nephew, Braun Breaker, carries the Rex Steiner name at the top of WWE right now. The legacy is alive. Scott Steiner was terrifying. He was simply more talented than anyone in his era could honestly match. He was unlike anyone before or since. He was not better than everybody. He was something rarer than that. Like the video, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.